Hey everyone, welcome to Collab Conversations, the podcast dedicated to sparking dialogue and meaningful conversations about the invaluable role of patient advocacy. I'm your host, Sabrina Hanna, and I'm thrilled that you're here for season 2. This episode's guest is anris Kica from the Life Saving Therapies Network with me. Anris has conducted policy research and strategic planning while advising elected officials and candidates seeking election. He has also endeavored to affect policy change towards economic integration of renewable energy and the preservation and inclusion of Indigenous languages in Canadian education and healthcare. He has attained a BSc degree in biology and biopharmaceutical science from the University of Ottawa. And Enris, you're fairly new to the patient advocacy landscape, and by new I mean like 5 years. So let's
Yeah.
start with you telling me how you got involved with Listen, because your background is super interesting, and I didn't know your background until I read your biography.
Yeah. So I did start school at University of Ottawa and studied biology and biopharmaceutical science. So I was very much involved in the sciences and in the medical and healthcare research space. And then, being in Ottawa, it's really hard to escape the policy and politics of everything, including science and research. So eventually I got to meet a few political and policy troublemakers, and through them I got to meet, Colin Cook and John Peter Bradford of the Life Saving Therapies Network, and that's kind of how I got, involved with Listen. I took part in their 2018 roundtable where they brought, I think it was about 80 experts from North America and the EU, brought them together just to kind of, see where everybody's at and get a good sense of the regulatory landscape around access to therapies and how do we ensure that, patients who are dying with or patients who have a life-threatening condition. I know there's a heavy focus on cancer, but Listen is more broadly about life-saving therapies and folks with life-threatening conditions. How to get those patients, broader access to better drugs, and that's kind of how I got involved and really touched on my science background and my troublemaking and government and the policy landscape. So I kind of married the two, the science and the policy, and it's been a really interesting ride working with a lot of wonderful people, and the community itself is wonderful, like the patient advocacy community, just getting everybody excited about moving the policy needle forward and making sure that we're improving access and we're improving the system more broadly as well. So that's kind of what I've been doing in the past 5 years, or trying to do in the past 5 years, and it's been quite a learning experience. I will say that you don't
Well,
realize what these things are until you're in it. So
that's right. And I mean, looking at your background, I think for me, and like I also come from a science background, and I'm wondering like what is it about advocacy that made you think like this would be a good career path?
um, I didn't really see it as much of a career path, but it was more of a frustration. It was like my work with Listen was born out of the frustration of seeing a lot of the incredible, you know, applied science and applied research that's being done, and also a lot of the basic research that's being done. And, wondering, well, why aren't we getting this drugs developed? Why aren't we getting these things to patients sooner? Why are people, still dying and struggling to get access to these things when a lot of research on diagnostics, on better diagnostics is being done, and there's some progress there? When there are better drugs that are emerging, there's a lot of work that's being done in the sciences. So seeing that from the research perspective and then going, why are people still struggling to access these things? That's kind of what it was. It was that frustration. And that's kind of how I got into, trying to understand the reasons why. And when you get into the regulatory system, the reimbursement system, and a lot of the challenges around clinical research as well, the way the clinical research system is set up. So that was kind of my journey into the advocacy side of things. It came out of that frustration of like I'm sitting at a in a classroom desk going, listening to my professors talking about all these great things that are being done, reading all these scientific journals, but it wasn't, in my experiences and the experience of the people that I knew, it wasn't really translating to, to the patient. So that was how I got into it.
Yeah. And so why do you think, like all this great research is being done and all these innovative medicines, therapies, technologies, devices are being developed? They're available to people outside of Canada. So why are we having so much trouble getting these innovations to patients in Canada?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons, but I think it all comes down to risk aversion. If
Mm.
you look at the way our regulatory systems are set up, whether it's Health Canada, whether it's CADA, whether it's other regulatory agencies, a lot of the policy decisions and the, I guess, legislative framework behind it is based upon mistakes that have happened in the past. I know thalidomide is the big example. I think one of the more popular examples that people know about the thalidomide crisis. So it a lot of the mentality behind why we have a lot of the regulations we have kind of came out of that risk aversion, that fear of not doing harm, right? Which is completely legitimate and totally fair. And I don't think we want anybody to suffer and to have harm done upon them by therapies or drugs that they should not be getting. But in Listen's perspective and in the context of people who have a very limited time to live, I mean, they've been given a cancer diagnosis and they've been told they've got 6 weeks to live. If there's a drug or a therapy that is scientifically backed and tested through rigorous clinical testing, and the data has shown that it could potentially extend their life or improve their quality of life while they're still alive, then I don't really see why we're limiting access to these things. That's kind of where the frustration comes in. It's like, well, I understand that you want to save people's lives and you want to prevent a lot of the birth defects and a lot of the potential harm that could be done. But for people who have a different risk reward perception and calculation, people who are told, you got X number of weeks, that's it's frustrating because I understand why the system is and why we try and be as rigorous as we can be with access. But I think in certain cases, I think we need a bit more flexibility, and we need our flexibility to take the front seat over to risk aversion. The risk aversion needs to take the back seat when it comes to certain patients and patient groups.
So you've talked about the regulatory process. I mean, we haven't gone in depth, but you've mentioned them a couple of times.
Yeah,
And so do you think that it stems from the regulatory process? Because I feel like with COVID, there have been some changes that were implemented. And I said COVID, please don't send me hate mail. So do you think that there have been like positive changes that have been implemented since COVID that are now making a difference in the way we access? And do you still see the regulatory process as sort of a major barrier?
yeah. Well, I think COVID really brought the issue home because it highlighted the urgent need for a therapy to this, I guess, global crisis that Canada was not excluded from. I mean, we were very much hit hard from it. If you look at the seniors in nursing homes and if you look at vulnerable patient populations, COVID did not spare those people. And I think it was the same throughout the world. I don't think we were unique in any way. Um, but there was, I believe, some movement to exclude the COVID vaccines and therapies from the Patent and Medicines Prices Review Board from their kind of regulatory oversight, just so we could speed up access to it. So for those who don't know, the PMPRB, or Patent and Medicines Prices Review Board, there's a lot of mouthful and a lot of acronyms, and that's one of the things that comes with the learning process of being in health policy. You learn a lot of acronyms and a lot of names that are mouthful. So their role is ultimately to oversee drug pricing in Canada and ensure that Canadians are not being charged excessive drug prices, which is a bit interesting because the word excessive and what they mean by excessive is not really defined in regulation, and they don't really have a consumer protection mandate. So they're a quasi judicial body that can oversee the pricing the list pricing of drugs in Canada to make sure they're not excessive, but not the actual pricing that gets negotiated. So it's a bit of a mess in and of itself, the PMPRB and the way the system is set up, the reimbursement system is set up. But we did see with the COVID vaccines and the COVID therapies that the government was willing to kind of, you know, ask the PMPRB to step aside so we can accelerate access to these much needed vaccines and therapies. And, which, gets us to the question, well, why can't we do that for people who are dying of cancer, right? If there's a drug, again, that can potentially save someone's life or extend someone's life or give them a better quality of life so they can do the things they would like to do with their family before they're gone, why are we still putting in all these barriers when timing is of the essence? I mean, their most precious commodity is time. It's not money. And for a G7 country, I think we can afford to ask the PMPRB to make exceptions when it comes to patients with lethal disease and lethal cancer.
So you see PMPRB more as a barrier versus Health Canada?
I think Health Canada has improved substantially. I think again it takes a long time for drugs to go through the regulatory process in Canada in general. But I think Health Canada has made some progress recently. I don't think there's so much a barrier. I think PMPRB and CADF, or the Canadian Drug Agency, it's been renamed now, and there's a lot going on there. But I think there are things we can do. And again, I don't want to undermine the importance of why these institutions were kind of brought into existence, but it's important to make sure that they serve their intended purpose and they're not doing harm, or they're not doing the harm that they would like to prevent.
Yeah, so I think actually that's a really important comment, is that they're not really doing what they were put in place to do. And when they're doing that, are they causing more harm to the people that they were put in place to protect? So,
right. It's great if they want to regulate and oversee, the safety and efficacy and cost effectiveness of a drug for something that's, not going to have an adverse effect or an adverse, I shouldn't say adverse. Let me word that differently, because that means something different to the clinical research community. But if there's something that's not going to have a negative impact on the life of a patient, or it's not going to be a life-threatening condition, and there are lots of drugs to treat this condition, then absolutely there should be regulatory oversight. We should get the best price possible and the best quality of drug possible. But if there are patients who are dying and there aren't that many options available for them in terms of therapeutics or treatment, then I think we need to really have that flexibility in the system. And I think that's one of the main things I really would like to get across with this conversation, is the need for flexibility to be able to discern between these things. Because right now it's really difficult for people to, move away from the rigid regulatory structures that exist and have that flexibility to make these decisions without really being penalized. So I think that's one of the things we need to change, is have that flexibility without, saying that, we should just get rid of all regulatory mechanisms and get rid of all the regulatory structures that we have in this country, but to say, we need to be a bit more flexible. We need to be a bit more streamlined in how we do things.
Yeah, I agree. I think flexibility is such a place where it's an area we don't do well. And we did it really well with COVID. So why can't we do it in oncology where people are dying?
Yeah. And I think that's, the multi-billion-dollar question, right? Is why can't we do it with folks who are dying of other diseases? I mean, their families would love to see it. They would love to see it, but it's, it comes down to political will. It comes down to, our willingness as well to accept more risk under certain circumstances, with the recognition and realization that this risk is an acceptable risk to somebody who, again, has a very limited time left with their family and their loved ones. If they can get a bit more time, or if they can get, the ability to live a relatively normal life while they're still alive, and do the things that they would like to do with their family before they unfortunately have to say goodbye, then I think we should give them that flexibility, and the regulatory system shouldn't be a hindrance to that.
Yeah.
And
And I
we
mean, to
give
be
people the
able to
right to
live,
die with dignity. It's like,
yes.
well, how about living with dignity, and living the last remaining weeks of your life with those weeks of dignity.
Yeah. And I mean, not everybody is going to benefit, but it's making sure that the people who, who are on those last days, weeks, months, years of their lives, that they're living it fully and not like going to hospitals and getting chemo and like getting these treatments that are not helping them.
Right, and that's I think you touched upon a really important thing. It's about making sure that patients are getting the treatments that work and help them, rather than giving them the stuff that doesn't help them or doesn't work as well, only for us to say, okay, well, this isn't working. Now let's get you on something that could potentially work, and let's try and enroll you in a clinical trial for something that could help you. Well, you spent all this time and all this energy
And all
giving them
this money
something.
that the government
Right,
could have saved.
right. And you've really weakened this patient now, giving them a lot of these harsh treatments when there could have been an opportunity to give them something else. So it's frustrating, but I hope that people listening to this don't leave with frustration, but leave with a bit of optimism, and understand that there are people out there trying to change these things, trying to implement a bit more flexibility. And I think that's where kind of the patient community comes in. And I think that's why the work is so important.
Yeah. And so, other than the regulatory process, are there other places where you would like to see more flexibility?
Well, we could have a nice long conversation about the way clinical research is set up. It's, again, there are lots of things that could be done to improve the clinical research system, but I'm afraid we will go back to regulatory, because it is a bit of a circular argument, because research sponsors won't want to do the things that regulators will look down upon, and regulators won't, accept things that kind of deviate from their process and protocol, because they're so risk averse. So it's kind of we're going in circles in a way. I think I know we want to talk a bit about patients and patient centricity. I think there's an opportunity there to kind of shift the conversation in both the regulatory aspects of clinical research and in the clinical research itself, by implementing, or I guess integrating the patient perspective and patient input in the clinical research protocol itself, and allowing the clinician and study sponsor to understand that certain endpoints are important to patients, and they should be looked at and they should be studied, and also allowing regulators the opportunity to peer into the patient perspective and understand why a study was done a certain way, why it was designed a certain way, with the patient in mind. Because the endpoints that may be important to a regulator, in their risk aversion and their desire to not want to do harm, those endpoints may be very different than what may be important to what a patient might want to see. So I think that's part of the opportunity that we have to reform the clinical research process, by having, I guess, patient-led clinical trials, if you want to put it that way. But I think there's an opportunity there.
So I had Bob Bick on. He was the second episode in the first season, and we did talk about oncology relevant endpoints beyond survival and PFS. And then I also had Barry Stein on from Colorectal Cancer Canada, who talked about the patient centricity in the clinical trial. So I think like we're all working sort of in our own little corners, but we're all like, all the work that everybody's doing is complementing each other, and hopefully hopefully at some point the regulators and the HTA and everybody will be able to come together and see that the stuff that we're working on is actually really important to the work they're doing, but also really important to the patients that they're working for and that we're also working for.
Yeah, and you know, Bob and Barry, there's, again, like I said, there's a wonderful patient advocate community that's really trying to, you know, move the needle forward and try and implement things that are more patient-centric and patient-friendly when it comes to the way things are done. And again, it's part of why I want people to listen to this and have a bit of optimism, despite all the challenges and problems that we're listing out. You know, I want people to understand that we're also trying to work on solutions. We have a decent understanding of what the problems are, but we're also trying to, you know, work with government and with regulators when we can to come up with ways of improving certain things. And I think that, you know, going beyond progression-free survival and overall survival and looking at other endpoints that matter to patients, I think that's one step we can take. And I think it also allows and it gives the regulators an opportunity to see that, you know, there's more to a clinical trial and there's more to clinical research than the metrics that they kind of look at as their baseline. That patients care about more things than that. That, you know, quality of life matters to patients, and well, what, you know, what kind of quality of life do they get from being on a drug that's in a clinical trial versus being on the standard of care? That matters to patients, right? So I think there are a lot of things that we need to work on, but I think there is that work. That work is being done, and I think it's somewhat encouraging. We might see some progress, but I would definitely keep pushing and endeavoring to do more. I think we can do more. You know, I don't think Canada is limited in our ability to do research. I don't think we're limited in our ability to regulate and govern. God knows we're not limited in our ability to regulate and have bureaucracy. So I think we need to find a way to make it work and have that flexibility in the system so it does work.
Yeah. So you briefly talked or mentioned the Canadian Drug Agency. And so how do you think that that is going to play into everything? I mean, I'm like really not clear still on what that is going to mean in the whole, you know, landscape, but you know, I like it was just announced
Yeah,
December
and
18th.
I
So
think
still
it
fairly
was in
new.
the yeah, it was in the health minister's mandate letter to, you know, implement a Canadian Drug Agency. But again, like you said, I think we'll have to wait and see how it pans out. I know CADF, before it was supposed to become the Canadian Drug Agency, did have a consultation around time-limited reimbursement, but it's kind of uncertain what that means in terms of, you know, what kind of drugs will be permitted to undergo the time limited reimbursement process. At what stage of clinical research will these drugs even be considered for the process? So there are a lot of questions around that. But I think time will tell what happens to the Canadian Drug Agency and how that's shaped. But again, it's an opportunity for patients and patient groups to raise their voices and kind of outline the things that matter to us, and also come up with, you know, models, clinical trial models, and, you know, potential research models that really reflect patient values and the patient voice and the patient perspective at the forefront of why we do the trial. Yes, we want to do the trial to test safety, efficacy, and to make sure that, you know, we can do these things in a relatively, you know, cost-effective way. But those things are important. But in terms of the patient values and the things that the endpoints that matter to patients, I think we need to do something that shows the regulators and also shows industry and shows the trial sponsors that this thing can work, and it can give you the data that you're looking for to make your decisions, but it can also be, you know, more beneficial to patients if it's done differently. So, but as far as the CDA goes, the Canadian Drug Agency goes, I think we'll have to wait and see if they're just a continuation of what CADF does, or if there are going to be significant policy changes that go with a change. I think time will tell, and I think there's an opportunity for us to push for those changes. So
I like your optimism, Anris.
yeah, well, you have to be. I mean, there's a lot that's on the line, and for patients, especially those, like I said, again, I really want to make the distinction. This is about patients who have very little left to live, very little time left to live. So for those patients, everything matters. Every policy improvement, everything matters. Every little change matters as long as it's in their benefit. So if we can be slightly optimistic about our approach, and if we can push for better with the recognition and expectation that we can do better, then I think we will get somewhere. But if we're constantly kind of, you know, pointing out the problem without really proposing a solution, I don't think we'll get very far.
Mm.
So that's kind of where my optimism comes from. It's kind of the yin and the yang. My frustration and my optimism. It has to balance out in the end, I think. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, I think that it's interesting that you bring it up, and it's like an important point to mention too, is that as patient advocates, yes, we're highlighting the problems within the healthcare system, but a lot of the time we're going to the policymakers and the decision makers and the government officials with some solutions too.
Right. And I think, you know, there are best practices and there are things we can learn from other countries as well. Right. And, Canada does not operate. I know the regulatory system is very siloed and, they don't really talk to each other, which is again, one of the things we'd like to change and one of the things we'd like to, implement flexibility upon and giving them, ensuring that I guess the different agencies are talking to each other and taking each other's, expectations and considerations into account when they make their decisions. I'll give you an example. The endpoints that Health Canada looks at to approve a drug or give their notice of compliance or conditional notice of compliance may be very different to what CADIF looks at to do their economic assessment. So there's an opportunity for, or I guess the Canadian Drug Agency now. Sorry, I'm still getting used to the new acronyms. But there's an opportunity to get these two institutions to talk to each other and kind of outline a standard for how they would like, what they would like to see a clinician and a trial sponsor do, and the kind of endpoints they would like to study in order to get through the regulatory system and get through it faster. And also add on top of that the patient-centric endpoints that, they should definitely consider, because ultimately if a drug isn't serving, the best interest of the patient, then really, do we even want it in the system, right?
Yeah. Well, that's really important. And I think a lot of the times the clinical trials are not designed to answer the HTA questions. And so, I mean, obviously, a lot of the clinical trials are they're being designed globally and not with a Canadian focus, but they're also, predominantly going through the FDA process. Like we know, like 100% of all the drugs that are ever created will go through the FDA versus, very small or a much smaller number that are going through
Yeah.
the Canadian process.
And that's one of the challenges. And I think one of the solutions that the government of Canada has come up with was, by I guess working closely with the FDA and other agencies through Project Orbis to kind of speed up the regulatory process of drugs that have gone through FDA approval. And if something has gone through FDA approval, they would go through a much more accelerated process here in Canada, because like you said, a lot, Health Canada and the FDA and the EMA have very, I guess, consistent endpoint requirements when it comes to certain drugs. So I think that's one of the ways that we can work with our international partners and our colleagues worldwide to make sure that we speed up access. If a drug is approved, it takes like a year to 2 years, like in terms of time delay between when a drug goes through the regulatory process in the States versus when it, finally gets approved and finally becomes available in Canada. So if we can do things like Project Orbis, where we work with the FDA and we work with the EMA, and we accelerate that process a bit and give Canadian patients faster access, because like you said, that they're going to go to the US and the EU first, because that's where the largest markets are. Canada is relatively speaking a very small market. I think it makes up anywhere between 2 to 3 or 1 to 2%, depending on what
2%.
numbers you look at. Yeah, it's nowhere near compared to the U.S., which makes up, I think, about 50%, makes up about half of the total global pharmaceutical market. So, us being so close to the U.S., it raises the question around, people that have access to financial resources and can go to the States and, can receive these drugs much faster than those who cannot. So I don't want to get into two-tier healthcare system here, but that is a concern, right? When people who have money can just simply go and get these drugs, while Canadian patients who do not have access to these vast financial resources would have to wait.
Yeah. And there are a lot of patients who don't have the financial resources who end up mortgaging their homes and doing whatever they have to do to be able to go to the US to get access to those drugs. But again, it's not a conversation we're going to have today, but
right. But I do want to bring it up because I know we take great pride in our public system, and people recoil at the idea of two-tier healthcare, but I do want to throw that into the conversation to really highlight the fact that, depending on your resource availability and your financial situation, that we're not really immune to two-tier healthcare and multi-tier healthcare, depending on, what you can afford to do. So.
Yeah, and I think Project Orbis on paper is a really great idea. But the thing is that once you go through, the Health Canada process, you still have to go through CADTH and INES. So this funnel is still happening. We're not getting access to these drugs for patients any quicker than we would have without Project Orbis.
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to learning from other countries, right? I know there have been lots of discussions around what can we learn from the United Kingdom and their National Institutes of Healthcare Excellence, or NICE. It's a very nice acronym, very nice of them to put that out there. But there are things we can do in terms of having time-limited reimbursement. I know CADTH has played with the idea, but other countries have figured this out. Germany does it, France does it, Italy, Switzerland, the UK. There's no reason why Canada cannot look at these countries, why we cannot reach out, why the regulators cannot reach out to their colleagues and their counterparts in these countries and say, hey, what works in your jurisdiction and why? And how can we implement these best practices here to speed up access and have that flexibility for patients who may need these drugs, with the understanding that this is going to be a time-limited thing. And once that time period is over, if the scientific and clinical evidence shows that there are better options available, we will not continue to fund this drug. We will fund better options and better alternatives. But until that data comes out, rather than making patients who are dying, rather than making them wait, we will give you the drug as long as it's safe and efficacious, and it can potentially help you and not do more harm than good. So I think there are things we can learn from other countries while doing things like Project Orbis and really, speeding up access, because we are a very small market, but we are, I think, a mighty country, and we can do everything.
We're a mighty country with a lot of desire.
Yeah.
In some areas. Right. So you and I talked about patient centricity at a conference in November. And the whole basis of that conference that we were at was about patient centricity. And the thing that I have a hard time with is, I know everybody's talking about patient centricity, everybody's jumping on this patient centricity bus, but what patient centricity means to me, what patient centricity means to you, what patient centricity means to one pharmaceutical company versus the different pharmaceutical company versus the government versus healthcare professionals, these, everybody could have their own definition of what patient centricity means. So how do we really build this patient-centric care or system when we're not working off the same definition?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point and a really important question that you raised. I think before we get to what it means to the regulators and what it means to the pharmaceutical industry and what it means to the doctors, I think first and foremost, we kind of have to establish what it means to patients and the patient community. Because I think different patient groups depending on, and different patients depending on, their disease area, it may mean different things. If you have something that's going to kill you in the next 3 weeks, patient centricity means something different than if you have something that you can live with and live a relatively normal life with. And it also varies based upon whether you have a rare disease or not, whether there are enough drugs that could treat your, or could potentially, deal with your condition, versus if there is nothing out there and if there's nothing being worked on. And I know that's a big issue in the rare disease space, especially the lethal rare disease space, where the patient population, isn't even big enough for you to do a clinical trial in some cases, because the data that you get is not really statistically significant when you have about 9 patients in an entire country that have a disease. And not to get into the financial incentive and lack thereof, because a drug company knows that they're going to have to charge a really high price for this drug in order to recoup some of their costs. So patient centricity will mean different things to different patient groups, and I think that's the first hurdle we have to overcome, is kind of have a big conversation and a wide conversation between different patient organizations and patient groups, but what it means to have patient centricity in the healthcare system for our individual sort of perspective is, and try and find some common ground in there. And I don't think we'll agree on everything, but I do believe that we will find a common ground. And once we do have, I guess, a common understanding and a common definition, if you will, I think that the next big challenge will be to convince the regulators that they should implement, these patient-centric values in their assessments and in their work, because I think the industry will be a lot more responsive to patient-centric values and patient-centric requirements if it's a regulatory requirement. Whereas if you try and get the industry to implement a patient-centric clinical trial or a patient-led clinical trial, they'll be willing to do it. I don't think they'll have a hesitancy to do it, but they will still want to, collect the endpoints that they need for the regulators to go through the regulatory process. So if patient centricity becomes part of the regulatory process, if the regulators are looking at patient centricity as the first and foremost thing in their assessments, then I think you'll see broader adoption in clinical trials and throughout industry. So I think that's my take on it. I'm sure there are lots of people who would disagree with that, but I think we have to kind of start somewhere, and we have to look within, and we have to get patient groups to first and foremost agree on what patient centricity means to them, and what it means to the broader community.
Yeah. And so do you think, like, when the patient community is defining what patient centricity is it like between the patient community, or do you think that it would be helpful to also have the other stakeholders in that conversation, so we're building this common definition?
I think you
You did
absolutely
say,
have
like,
to have,
first and foremost with the patient community, but is it just the patient community and then it spreads out, or is it like?
I think so. I think you have to get the patient community to kind of establish a set of criteria for what patient centricity means and patient leadership means. And then you can take these criteria to the other stakeholders. You can take them to the medical community, you can take them to industry, you can take them to regulators, and try and broaden the acceptance and adoption of these patient-centric values. But it's really difficult if different patient groups and different patient organizations are going to regulators, or going to the industry, or going to the medical community with different definitions and different sets of criteria. It becomes, almost a maze in and of its own, and really becomes counterproductive in terms of, streamlining and making sure that the system is working more smoothly if you have different definitions of patient centricity. Because what definition do you go on, right? So I think that we kind of have to establish that within the patient community, and then seek broader adoption and acceptance of it.
Yeah. I think it's just so crazy that, like, there isn't a standard definition of what patient centricity is, and like a pharmaceutical company version of patient centricity could be so different than like a NGO's definition of what patient centricity is. Like I remember when Cadith held their conferences a few years ago, and they had that patients included checkbox on their event listing, and it was like, what does that mean exactly? Because I mean, I was invited to the event, but I wasn't consulted in any way, shape, or form.
Right, and it gets, and I think we're really getting into the nitty gritty, and I think we're getting into the importance of why we need to have this broader conversation with the patient community. What does it mean to be patient-centric? When you say patients involved or patients consulted, what were they involved in? What were they consulted on? Was it something, like you said, that was done as a formality, just to tick a box, or was it something that was done in a thorough, substantive way to really get a sense of the patient perspective and patient input, and use that input to really shape policy, right? Because there's a difference. There's a difference between, doing, the glossy version and ticking a box, and there's a difference in doing the hard work and getting, the different patient groups and getting the different patient perspectives and trying to integrate them all into one coherent policy objective.
Yeah.
That's the challenging work that needs to be done versus the easy sort of, well, we consulted patients and this is what they told us, and now we can tick a box and say that, we're patient-centric, I guess. So I think it's about doing things that include patients and really take patient perspectives into consideration when making decisions about these patients, kind of the nothing about us without us sort of mantra. But there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done to achieve that, and I think there has to be a willingness to do that work, and it's absolutely necessary that we do that work.
So what would you like to see happen in this space?
In the patient centricity space?
Well, the patient centricity space, but also like in that, like what we were just talking about making these important decisions, thinking about the people that it's going to impact. I mean, I think patient centricity is an important part of that, but I mean, it doesn't have to be. What do you think?
I do think it's incredibly important, and I think with your point earlier about making sure that we have one understanding and one definition of the core values of patient centricity, I think that's going to be an important stepping stone to really implementing patient-centric healthcare throughout the country. But first and foremost, we have to kind of establish what it means to have a patient-centric process or a patient-centric healthcare system. And that's going to be a lot of work that we need to do as patient groups internally. But I would like to see patients consulted a lot more. I would like to see patient perspectives integrated into policy decisions a lot more. I think that's really important. I know, for example, the CDA, or CADF, previously known as CADF. Sorry, for those that don't know, CADF is the Canadian Agency for Drug and Technologies in Health. Right? I got it right, I think.
Yes.
Again, another mouthful. But they do seek patient input when they do their HTA evaluations. They do seek input from patients, and to get their perspectives when of their quality of life and their value of the drug to them. But it's kind of unclear to patients in the patient community, what they do with the input that patients provide, how much weight is put behind this patient input, and how much it's considered when they do their HTA evaluation, right? Because patients will submit it. If you ask patients to provide their input and provide their perspective, either good or bad, of a certain drug or therapy that they were on, they will submit it to the regulator. But it's kind of unclear to patients what they kind of get in return in terms of how much their opinion and their input is even taken into consideration. So I think some clarity on that would be very useful.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I think that was something that was talked a lot about when I started, and obviously the conversation around that had started way before I started doing this work. So, I mean, it's at least been 10 years since we've been talking about like what value do the patient submissions bring into the HTA process? How are they evaluated? How is that information used to make a decision? And 10 years on, nobody has an answer. 10 plus years on,
Right.
nobody has an answer.
And if we had that answer, I think it would be, you would see a lot more patient engagement if we as patient organizations and patient advocates could go to folks who are receiving these drugs to say, hey, this is how you will tangibly improve the HTA system by offering your submission, rather than saying, hey, just provide your submission. They'll maybe look at it, maybe they won't. We really don't know what they do with it.
Yeah.
Right? Patients will be a lot more encouraged to participate in the process. And I think it gets to, again, patient centricity and the patient willingness to participate if they understand and they see the value of their participation. So I think if we could have some clarity on how the HTA process works and how patient input, factors into the HTA evaluation process, I think that'll be an important step forward as well.
Yeah. Especially as we move into this like patient preference data and like there's a movement towards that. So at some point we're gonna have to better understand that HTA process.
Yeah, especially if kind of it's without HTA approval, it's really difficult to get a drug reimbursed on a public system, right? So I think understanding how the HTA approval or lack thereof is obtained, I think that'll be important. I think more importantly, understanding how the patient perspective factors in, I think that'll be a game changer for patients and patient advocacy group, because we'll know exactly how much the regulator and the HTA body values their input.
Mm-hmm. So do you think you talked about, or you didn't talk about it, but you mentioned it, that a patient-led clinical trial, do you think that would make a difference?
I think so. I think if you have it as an example, and there have been different patient-led clinical trials, and we're trying to set up a model for oncology, for an oncology patient-led clinical trial. I think if you go to the regulators with an example of how it could work and show to them that first and foremost, it can work, it can produce the data that they need to do their work. And if you show to the industry that it can be beneficial to patients and it can accelerate the process, then I think it will make a difference. But I think first and foremost, you kind of have to show that it works. And you can only do that if you actually try it. We can talk about it. We've done a lot of research and a lot of, reviews of scientific data and publications on patient-led and patient-involved in clinical trials. But once you kind of do it and see how it works and understand the opportunities and the pitfalls of doing it, I think there's a chance there to really convince people, right? Because you have something tangible to show. So I think doing a patient-led clinical trial will have a substantive impact on the regulatory process, first and foremost, to really show to Health Canada and CADA and PNPRB and TCPA. Again, lots of acronyms in the healthcare space, but it'll be of value to show them that this can be done, and it will not be detrimental to patients. I know they're risk averse and they don't want to, do things that harm patients, but at the same time, we need to speed up access and we need to do things differently for patients who are dying of their disease and don't have very many options to deal with. So,
And is this something that Listen is working on?
it is something that Listen will be working on and very much wants to work on, but I think we'll be working very closely with our partners in the patient advocacy space to first and foremost establish what patient leadership means. If you break down the word leadership, it means different things to different people. But in terms of patient leadership in a clinical trial, that's a very specific concept. And ultimately, it comes down to the extent to which patients are consulted with in the design of the clinical trial protocol and the extent to which these consultations and that patient input is actually integrated into the clinical trial protocol. So when it comes, I know we touched a bit on the endpoints and looking at the things that matter to patients in terms of the trial endpoints, what they'd like to see from the drug versus what the regulator would like to see from the drug. Integrating more of those endpoints into the clinical trial process, looking at other things like surrogate endpoints in the clinical trial and evaluation process. So again, it'll come down to a conversation with a lot of patient groups and patient partners to kind of establish, again, those values and what they'd like, how they would define the level of patient involvement that should be part of a patient-led clinical trial. And this doesn't mean, I really want to highlight this, it doesn't mean that patients will be running the trial and doing the trial and collecting all the data and doing that. We will partner, of course, with medical professionals and the whole 9 yards in that respect. I mean, I don't think we're going to just pull patients out of the hospital beds and ask them to run a clinical trial. But it is about really taking that patient perspective and implementing it into the design of the trial and into how rigorous the design is and how rigid it is. I mean, one of the things that's a challenge when it comes to, I guess, inclusion and exclusion criteria for the clinical trials, which basically tell you which patients can and cannot be on the trial. That's a challenge.
Yeah.
We in our 2018 roundtable, one of the things that kind of emerged from those discussions in that publication was this idea of the quote unquote Olympic athlete of patient. The endpoints, not the endpoints, the inclusion exclusion criteria being so rigid and so narrow that you're kind of selecting patients that you think would most benefit from the trial rather than patients who most need the drug but might not have the best outcome as a result of the stage of the progression of their disease. So that's an issue that we need to address, because I think we're
the healthiest of the sickest.
Yeah. So that's something that might be of interest in a patient-led clinical trial, to make sure that the inclusion exclusion criteria factors that in.
And so what was really interesting about CAR-T is that in the clinical trials, obviously it was the healthiest of the sickest people who were getting CAR-T, but in the real world, what they saw is that even the older people, even the ones with the most comorbidities, were still benefiting from receiving CAR-T. So that's actually a really interesting topic to bring up. And I did want to ask something else, and again, it's escaped me. But so when we're talking about patient-led clinical trials, and like you said, it's not about the patients actually doing all the work within the clinical trials, and leave that to the experts. But I feel like if we're developing the drugs that the patients actually need and are important to them, then all the other processes just become easier to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, you kind of have an objective to try and achieve now. You have a goal to achieve, and that is to have a trial and a drug that serves the best interest of the patient, which is the way it should be.
Yeah.
At least in my perspective, and I suspect in a lot of people's perspective. So if you design the process, whether it's the clinical trial or the regulatory mechanisms around it, to serve the best interest of the patient, particularly in the context of patients who, I know JP likes to say this a lot, know the expiration date on their birth certificate and don't have a lot of time left. So if you can really help those people out and design a process which is to their ultimate interest, which is to either extend their life or give them a better quality of life, then I think we've done something with patient-led clinical trials here. But it all has to come from the patients, I think.
Yeah, agreed. And so just as we start wrapping up, are there any other things that you're working on with Listen that you would like to talk about?
I know we are working really hard to try and, make it easier for patients to get access. So we're doing that by talking to the regulators. We're doing that by talking to the elected officials and legislators. What we would like to see is some movement in terms of access to experimental drugs through clinical trials by making clinical trials more open and making those drugs more available. Again, within the understanding that these are drugs that have been tested for their safety and efficacy, and they will not do more harm than good. So we don't want to give patients who are kind of in their last moments with their family, give them snake oil and all this other nonsense that doesn't work. But we want to make sure that if there's something that's being clinically tested that could potentially help them, how do we get them access, maybe in the clinical trial framework or potentially even outside the clinical trial framework? So that's something that we would like to push for here in Canada.
And so what are your 3 pressing areas of focus that you would like to see policy change, that you're working on to see policy change?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been the big 3 for us, which is the clinical research reform, the reimbursement reform, and the regulatory reform that goes around that. I mean, in terms of clinical research, it's about making it more patient-friendly and patient-centric. On the reimbursement, it's about having, that flexibility and that time, looking at what other jurisdictions are doing to have things like expedited access or time-limited reimbursement. And on the regulatory front, it's about, and again, this is why we've been somewhat encouraged by Health Canada and the things they've done lately, like the work they've done through Project Orbis, by partnering with other jurisdictions and kind of speeding up access in that regard. So looking at things we can do with our international partners, because research and, like you said, drug development is international. I know we'd like to think that we've got a great research ecosystem here in Canada, and we do. We've got some, wonderful scientists. And again, stemming from my frustration of why this research isn't really translating to better outcomes for patients. That's kind of how I got into this. But there's a whole global research ecosystem out there and drug development ecosystem. And along with it, there's an entire global regulatory and reimbursement ecosystem that Canada is a part of. And I think we can learn from partners around the world, and we can do a lot of wonderful things here if we're willing to, and if we're willing to take on a bit more risk, take on more calculated risk, I should say, and do so in the right context, and do it with the aim and the goal of ultimately helping patients. So
And
that's kind of what
so
listening would look like. Yeah.
what would be your one key takeaway for people who are listening?
My key takeaway would be, I know it's frustrating, and I know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's a lot that Canada has to do to improve access and to expedite access for patients who are dying. And I think it's important to be optimistic, but it's also important to hold government accountable. And it's important to hold regulators accountable. That would be my key takeaway for people who are listening. It's not to be down in the dumps at all the troubles and all the problems, but to really, take the challenges and use it as motivation to try and improve things. So that would be my one sort of message.
That's a very optimistic message to leave on. And I don't want to say anything else, because I feel like I've been doing this for so long that I don't have that optimistic lens anymore. But
I know it's difficult to get lost in, the mess and the spider web of regulatory nonsense that exists out there, and really scratch your head and wonder, well, why are we doing things this way versus what other countries are doing? It seems to work over there, right? They seem to be getting faster access, and they seem to be getting cheaper drugs and more drugs, particularly in oncology. I'm specifically talking about the UK now. I mean, I think they spend less per capita and less on total on drugs than we do, and they have access to more drugs and faster access. So
yeah.
why aren't we looking at, why aren't we talking to our friends across the pond and saying, how did you guys manage this? How can we implement some of these things here? So I know it's frustrating, but the optimism stems from really two things. The best practices in other countries, i.e. we can look at the UK, and if we have the political will, we can implement some changes and improve the system here. And also the patient community itself, and how dedicated and resourceful and committed they are to, really improving things. So I think my optimism really lies in the fact that the solutions are out there. We just have to be willing to go ahead and implement them, but also, the fact that there are people pushing for those solutions, and it's not really forgotten.
Yeah, I think that that's one thing that we've done really well here is our patient advocacy community is really top notch. And I would even argue that we're like top of the pack when it comes to patient advocacy. Maybe it's
But
because
we
we have
have to
so
be.
to do.
We have to be. There are so many challenges to overcome, and it's like we really have to keep bringing them up and have to hold the government's feet to the fire and the regulators' feet to the fire. But I think we can't become discouraged, because these things do take time, and they do take political will, and they take a lot of, consistency in terms of always asking for better and always demanding better. And I think we can do better. So
Yeah, I agree. We can do better and we have to do better for patients.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Anris. This was such a fun conversation. I mean, fun. It was
Yeah.
a great conversation.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed it. And I don't know if people, I'm sure, listen to this, they didn't get to see my terrible painting. So
Well, you can show
I
them
am
now
an
if you
amateur.
want to.
Yeah, I'm an amateur painter, and I've forayed into painting a dog, so it is not very good.
Are
I'd
you
like to
showing
say
us?
it's abstract. Oh, sure, I'll show it. It's very,
It's reminiscent of like the Monets and it's the
not going on
paintbrush
the
stroke
ceiling of the Vatican anytime soon. It's not going to end up in any.
at the Louvre.
No, I don't think it's going at the Louvre.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Adris, for the conversation and for showing
Yeah.
us your dog painting. And if you enjoyed this conversation and Adris's painting, be sure to subscribe, share, stay tuned for more conversations. Until next time, I'm Sabrina Hanna, signing off for Collab Conversations.